All right, welcome back to the deep dive, everyone. We cover a lot of global history here, but today we're staying a little closer to home, at least for me. We're diving into the story of Fort Lee Historic Park. And it's in New Jersey, right?
Yep, right there across the river from Manhattan.
Yeah, exactly. And it might seem like just another local park, but trust me, this place has got some seriously deep roots in American history.
Oh yeah, it's a big one, especially when you think about the Revolution.
The Revolution, that's right. We're talking Revolutionary War, folks. And we're going to use, all sorts of historical information, records, maps, accounts to understand why this spot mattered so much back in the day. What really went down here.
Okay, so first things first, you got to picture this, all right? You're up high, way up high on the Hudson Palisades. We're talking dramatic cliffs, and you're looking out over Burdett's Landing. They used to call it Mount Constitution back then. And it was 1776.
1776, yeah, that's the year, of course.
Right, so just imagine looking across the Hudson River from that vantage point towards Manhattan, seeing where Fort Washington would eventually be built. The views must have been incredible, even then. But of course, now you'd also see the George Washington Bridge and the whole Manhattan skyline. But still, that high ground, that bluff, that was key back then. And it's still key to understanding what went down.
It really sets the stage, doesn't it? And it's kind of amazing when you think about it. This isn't just a story about the Revolution, right? I mean, this bluff, this land has been important for a lot longer than that. We're talking thousands of years. Native Americans, various tribes lived here, called this area home long before any Europeans arrived. So there's layers of history here. But then, bam, 1776, everything changes. And this same bluff, the one we're talking about, becomes General George Washington's encampment. Just imagine him there with his troops.
Right there on the cliffs, facing Fort Washington, a key strategic location.
Exactly. So our mission today in this deep dive is to figure out what exactly made this seemingly small park so important. Why this spot? Why does this piece of land hold so much weight in the grand scheme of the Revolution? That's what we're going to find out.
Totally. It's a good question to ask.
All right, well, let's start with the beginning. How did Fort Lee come to be? Where did it all start?
Our sources tell us that it wasn't even called Fort Lee at first. It was originally named Fort Constitution. And construction began in July of 1776 on the west side of the Hudson, following orders from the big guy himself.
George Washington, yeah.
Yep, George Washington. He directed General Mercer to get it done.
Washington was a smart strategist. He understood that the Hudson River was a crucial waterway, super important for controlling the region, and he knew he had to prevent the British from sailing warships up that river, dividing the colonies in half.
Like a wedge.
Yeah, exactly. So the idea was to establish powerful fortifications on both sides, like a pincer move.
Oh, I see. Fort Constitution on the New Jersey side and Fort Washington on the New York side. Basically like a fortified gate guarding the lower Hudson. Boom.
Boom, a gate. I like that. So they were really focusing on defense then.
Defense first, absolutely. And the initial construction, it was all concentrated down by the water at Burdett's Landing.
Right.
But later on, they started adding more defenses higher up on the bluff, which makes sense, right?
Yeah, get up high, get a better view. Makes sense.
Yeah, and it was, Joseph Phillips from the New Jersey State Militia who supervised all that later work.
Yeah.
And you got to think about it. Building a fort in the middle of a war, it's no easy feat. I mean, it must have been chaotic.
Oh, yeah, I bet. Lots of moving pieces.
Yeah. And then you got to remember, the Army, they basically commandeered the ferry service that was already running at Burdett's Landing.
Oh, so they just took it over.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
I mean, the owner of the ferry, Peter Burdett, he was actually a patriot, a supporter of the cause, but he still had to leave his home.
Wow. That's got to be tough.
It is. And it's even more complex when you consider that he offered the labor of the enslaved people he owned to help with the construction.
Oh, wow. That's a whole other layer to this story.
Yeah. It speaks volumes about the contradictions of the time.
Right. So then, in September 1776, the fort finally gets its name, Fort Lee, in honor of General Charles Lee. And it's interesting, I read that when Washington was at Fort Lee, he actually used Peter Burdett's house as his headquarters. That stone house right there on the bluff.
Yeah, that was his HQ for a while.
Man, so many crucial decisions must have been made right there in that house.
Oh, for sure. High-stakes meetings. And don't forget, the ferry line that connected Fort Lee to Fort Washington, It was a lifeline, the primary supply route, the only direct link between those two forts for a time.
Yeah, that ferry was super important, wasn't it? It wasn't just about the forts themselves. They were also putting things in the river. Those, what are they called?
Chevaux de frise.
Chevaux de frise. Yeah, that's it. Basically, big obstacles, right?
Yeah, big wooden structures, sometimes with spikes. They were placed in the river south of where they later planned to put the Hudson River chain, all designed to block British ships to make the river impassable.
So it was all about controlling the waterway.
Absolutely. Denying access to the enemy, that was a major objective.
It makes sense, but unfortunately, things didn't exactly go as planned for the Americans.
Oh, yeah. Things were about to get a whole lot tougher. This is where we get to the defense and, well, the fall of Fort Lee.
Right. The Battle of Fort Lee, November 19, 1776. A date you really should remember, folks. This was the beginning of the British and Hessian invasion of New Jersey.
Yeah, a turning point in the campaign. And it came hot on the heels of another American defeat. Just 3 days before, on November 16th, the Continental Army was defeated and captured at Fort Washington, across the river.
So that left Fort Lee very vulnerable then, exposed.
Yeah, and with the Royal Navy now controlling the Hudson, Fort Lee was pretty much wide open. General William Howe, he was a British commander, he saw his chance, ordered General Charles Cornwallis to move quickly, clear out those rebel troops from New Jersey before winter hit.
So the pressure was on.
Big time. Time was of the essence. And the British, they had serious numbers. We're talking about 5,000 troops, including Hessian units under Colonel Carl von Donop. They started crossing the Hudson on barges under cover of darkness on the night of November 19th.
A surprise attack.
Well, they tried to be as quiet as possible. Cornwallis himself, he landed with, I don't know, somewhere between 2,500 and 5,000 troops on November 20th at a spot called Lower Closter Landing, later known as Hyler's Landing. His plan was to trap Washington. After the defeats at Brooklyn and Fort Washington, he thought he could crush the Americans in New Jersey.
So where did he land exactly? I know there's been some debate about the location.
Right, you're talking about that whole Upper Closter Landing thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so for a long time, people thought the British landed further north at Upper Closter Landing in Alpine, where the Alpine Boat Basin is now. But, more recent research, it suggests that the actual landing spot was Lower Closter Landing. The path they took, it eventually became a farmer's road to Hyler's Landing. It's funny how history gets revised, as we get more information, more evidence.
It's like a detective story, always searching for clues.
Exactly. But yeah, after they landed, Cornwallis, he marched his troops up the Palisades, a rough climb, steep cliffs, and then they headed south through the Northern Valley. The geography of this area, it played a big role in how the battle unfolded.
It's all connected. The land, the river, the strategy.
Totally. And speaking of the land, imagine being there at Fort Lee on November 16th. That's when George Washington, from that same bluff, witnessed the battle at Fort Washington. He saw it all unfold, He must have known right then and there that things were looking bad, really bad.
That's a chilling thought. Watching your own troops get defeated from afar. And this is where we have that incredible story of Peter Bourdette's son, the ferry owner.
Oh, yeah, young Peter. What a story that is.
Right. So his son, also named Peter, he was only 16, but he was helping the Continental Army. In the days leading up to the evacuation, this teenager, he rowed across the Hudson multiple times, gathering intel for Washington.
Talk about bravery. 16 years old, rowing right into enemy territory.
He was basically a spy.
Yeah, teenage spy. It's amazing. And it gets better. The night before the battle for Fort Washington, young Peter, he rowed Washington himself out to the middle of the river for a secret meeting with his top officers.
Wow.
Talk about being in the thick of it.
So this kid, he was at the heart of some major military decisions.
Absolutely. But then, reality set in. With Fort Washington gone and the British landing at Closter, Washington and Nathanael Greene knew they had to get out of Fort Lee fast. They ordered the evacuation on the morning of November 20th. They were outnumbered, outmaneuvered. It was time to retreat.
The difficult decision, I'm sure.
No, I bet, but a necessary one. They started heading west, crossing the Hackensack River at New Bridge Landing, then the Passaic River at Aquacanunk Bridge. They had to abandon supplies, keep moving. Just imagine the morale. They were defeated, on the run, winter coming.
It must have been a terrible time. Morale must have been just in the pits.
Oh, yeah. But there's a bright spot here, a story about resilience. Thomas Paine, he was retreating with the Army. And guess what he was doing? Writing. He was writing his famous pamphlet, The American Crisis. Those lines, "These are the times that try men's souls." He wrote that during the retreat from Fort Lee.
Wow, really?
Yep. Talk about finding inspiration in the darkest of times.
Yeah.
That pamphlet, it was like a shot in the arm for the Americans. Helped boost morale, reminded everyone why they were fighting. It's a perfect example of how even in retreat, even in defeat, the fight for independence continued.
It wasn't just about battles, was it?
No, it was about ideas, too. About keeping the spirit alive.
Powerful stuff. All right, well, let's fast forward a bit, shall we? It's amazing to think that today, this site, it's preserved as Fort Lee Historic Park.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. The idea to make it a park goes all the way back to, like, 1952.
So they really recognized its importance early on.
They did. And today, you can actually visit a reconstruction of the 1776 encampment. They've got a blockhouse, a battery, living quarters,
Yeah.
plus a visitor's center where you can really dig into the history.
Oh, that sounds cool. I've got to go check that out.
You should.
Yeah.
And the views, oh my God, the views from the park are stunning. You can see the George Washington Bridge, the Hudson River, the Manhattan skyline. You're standing there looking out at the same landscape, but it's a completely different world.
Time travel without a time machine.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And then there's Monument Park, up at the northern end of Fort Lee Historic Park. It was dedicated in 1908 by the Daughters of the American Revolution. That area, it was actually part of the original Fort Constitution. Over 2,600 troops were stationed there.
A lot of history packed into that one spot.
Oh, yeah. And they even reconstructed Monument Park in 2004 for the Fort Lee Centennial.
The big celebration.
Yeah. And they put a time capsule there,
Wow.
to be opened in 2104.
Wow, what a cool idea.
It is. And you know what? Monument Park, along with Continental Army Plaza in Brooklyn, they're the only two parks in the entire U.S. that are dedicated specifically to the soldiers of the American Revolution. That's pretty special.
Very special. And there's even a museum there, right?
The Fort Lee Museum. Yep, right
Yeah.
there in Monument Park.
Yeah.
If you really want to dive deep into the details, the artifacts, that's the place to go. You can touch history there.
Well, folks, there you have it. Fort Lee, a place that might seem small, but played a huge role in the early days of the Revolutionary War. It's all about location, and those early efforts to defend the Hudson River. The story of Fort Lee, it highlights the incredible challenges that the Continental Army faced back then.
It really does. And it's not just about the big battles. It's about the human stories, too. Peter Bourdette, his son, Thomas Paine. These were real people facing real challenges, showing courage and resilience in extraordinary circumstances. And that's what makes history come alive, right? When we remember that these were real people, just like us, but living through something truly extraordinary.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What if things had gone differently? What if the Continental Army had been able to hold on to Fort Lee and Fort Washington? Would the war have played out differently? Would the United States even exist today? It's a question worth pondering. It makes you think about how seemingly small events or locations can have massive consequences down the line.
Yeah, the butterfly effect. One small change can lead to huge, unforeseen outcomes. History is full of those moments. That's what makes it so fascinating.
It really does. Well, listeners, if you're ever in the New York City area, do yourself a favor and take a trip to Fort Lee Historic Park. Walk those grounds, take in the views, and just imagine, really imagine everything we talked about today. Or if you can't visit in person, do some reading, some research, dig into the American Revolution. There's so much to discover. And as always, thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. We'll be back soon with more deep dives into history